Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? How's your soul? How's your, saints? How are your saints? Tomorrow's All Souls Day. Today's All Saints Day. So I guess this is the day that they've been singing about forever in New Orleans all this time when the saints go marching in. They must be marching somewhere today, I assume, unless this is their day of rest and they don't do any marching. The rest of us are supposed to march. Not really familiar with the practice for All Saints Day, but congratulations. It means you made it to November 1st. Halloween is over. Did you give away all the candy? Do you have some left over? It rained in our area, so we had depressed turnout. This was trick-or-treater suppression going on. As you know, the Republicans control the weather or something like that, or maybe we do. I forget exactly who's got control of the weather and whether or not it takes 60 votes to change the weather. I'm unclear on this process. But at any rate, it did suppress trick-or-treater turnout to some extent yesterday, even though, and we really should have been poised for massive turnout, the kids had off from school yesterday, and it had nothing to do with the holiday because it's not a holiday that you ordinarily take off for. It was what they used to call teacher workshops, which I guess in our school system they now call unencumbered planning day, I think is basically, in other words, that you can do lesson plans all day long during the workday and not have to do it over the weekend, but not be burdened with actually have to teach the classes today, which, it takes a long time to plan out the classes, and that's otherwise done, I guess, as homework. So they give them teacher work days, and like I said, I think when I was a kid, I was always under the impression that the teacher work days meant they had, and maybe I just confused them, they might have had also teacher workshop days where they actually had, convened some workshop where all the teachers got together and learned something about learning, which is, I guess, the setting in which, in the modern sense, you would gather all your teachers into an auditorium to indoctrinate them with CRT, as is the theory among the right wing. I'm also surprised we made it all the way through the day without anybody credibly floating the idea that that our particularly controversial, that is to say, mainstream American school board here in Loudoun County, where they've accused the school board of all sorts of nefarious activity. Can't believe that they didn't take the time to accuse them of giving off for a satanic/pagan holiday. There's nothing satanic about it, I don't think, per se, unless it's been adopted in later days by people. I don't even know if there is is there a traditional satanic church, or is it just a modern invention that people are, I don't know. At any rate, I don't think it has anything to do with that. There's a pagan holiday, which is spelled funny versus how it's pronounced, I understand. I guess it's pronounced like Samhain or something like it, but it's spelled Samhain. I don't really know why that is, but I guess it's Celtic/Celtic. I looked that one up from pronunciation yesterday, and it's Donald Trump's favorite. You can pronounce it either way, I'm told, and you actually can. And sometimes it depends whether you're talking about the United States basketball team, the NBA team Celtics, or you're talking about the UK Scottish football, that is to say soccer team. And, even there's some discrepancy there, as some, I guess, in the south of Great Britain, among the English, I guess they sometimes will say Celtic, but that, I guess those of more likely Celtic extraction, the Scots and Irish more frequently say Celtic, but even there were people I looked at a discussion board, and there were people who fought over it from within Scotland, from within Ireland. I don't understand how it's happening, but at any rate, I think that one you can get away with the other pronunciation. But at any rate, that's the pagan origins of it. I noticed that the very interesting Twitter feed Jew who has it all, who always has the very clever the very clever premise of writing from the perspective of a public school teacher in an imaginary United States in which the majority of the population are Jewish, and Christians represent a distinct minority, and explaining everything from a Jewish perspective, what it would look like to a majority Jewish American population to be inclusive of and try to reach out and understand the Christian minority around them. Always very interesting and standing things on its head. I thought the funniest part of that, of the Halloween thread, was the trouble that the protagonist has in understanding why it is that Christians celebrate Halloween, and of course it's a misconception too, to a certain extent. Like, okay, it's not a Christian holiday per se necessarily, but I guess it started as one because it's for All Saints Day, and then the evening of All Saints Day was the All Hallows Eve, became Halloween, but it somewhere along the line lost its importance in Christian liturgy for the most part. I suppose there's some traditionalists who still practice it, but I don't know them and they don't tell me so. But at any rate, the confusion for the Jewish protagonist and understanding how it is that they are treated as separate holidays. They actually treat this as two separate holidays. Halloween on so-called October 31st, and they note again in passing that it's difficult to tell. There's no fixed dates for things on the Christian calendar because, of course, they fall all over the place from year to year if you look at it from the perspective of the Jewish calendar, which is the lunar calendar. But at any rate, that so-called October 31st is for some reason celebrated as Halloween, whereas so-called November 1st is celebrated as All Saints Day, even though it's the same day. Because, of course, in the Jewish practice of it, the day ends and a new day begins at sundown, which, makes a lot more sense, in the ancient world. The sun has gone down, the day is over. It's now the next day. We don't have to, instead of arbitrarily fixing it at midnight, which makes no particular sense to anyone, really. I mean, you grow up with it, it makes a certain amount of sense. But if you don't have clocks sitting around, when does the day end? When the light goes away. That's the end of the day. What happens next? It's dark. The first part of a day begins in darkness. Then, of course, almost sleep through that part and then get up when the sun comes up, and then you have your day. But according to that method of timekeeping, of course, Halloween, the night to us of even me, of October 31st is a different day. And then at midnight, it becomes a different day. And now that's how it becomes 2 days. Well, that's a mystery too. Jew who has it all. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting and funny. You should check it out. And it's in a extended, I guess because it goes on for so long, you could call it a rant, though it doesn't feel particularly ranty. But that's the genius of the account. Check it out. All right. What else is happening today? It is Tuesday, and that means we will plan to hear from, here's the news. I was planning to get our usual Tuesday call from Joan McCarter and then praising her for all the days she gets up so early in Pacific time zone, no less, to speak with us. It's a difficult thing to do. And of course, there's any number of emergencies going on when you're relocating and you got pets and everybody needs to get to the doctor from time to time and you have a new house and things are falling apart here and there, just that you didn't expect. And then we have another of those situations today. But I figured I'd use All Saints Day to praise Saint Joan, who wakes up in the dark. How's that? She says Saint Joan in the dark and speaks to us each Tuesday. But this Tuesday is going to be different. Next Tuesday, of course, will be election day. I don't know how busy she's going to be that early in the day, but you never know. It's a big day, obviously, at Daily Kos. Today, it's something else. And it's a water emergency, it turns out. So, okay. All right. I'll let her know that I've seen it. Let her know. You'll hear me typing it. Got it. Let's see. Hope everything recovers quickly, we'll say. It's nothing. It's not a big deal. Nobody's hurt. It's a water emergency. A little bit of leaking in the basement and something you got to pay attention to. You can't be just telling the water, hang on, I'll be right back. I've got to go and take care of the Kagro in the Morning podcast. So, okay. Apologies there. Sorry, we're going to miss you. And hopefully we can catch up. We'll see what kind of schedule you've got for Election Day. Otherwise, we'll just run around biting our nails and, I don't know, I guess declaring victory. That appears to be the fashion these days. All right. So let's see what's been on my mind this morning when I jumped on to Twitter to find out what was going on. And I guess maybe the days for that are numbered as we will begin to discover that, I don't know, every morning's news is strangely pro-Elon Musk. You know, at some point, I guess we'll find out whether that's the case or not. And let's see, some other interesting prospects for today's reading. Anyway, I got stopped by and stuck on reading, and I enjoyed reading it, a Twitter thread from Philip Bump, and I don't know if it's necessary to go through the whole thing because I think we're all pretty much aware of what it is he was writing about. And in this case, it is the debunking of Dinesh D'Souza and his 2000 Mules movie and book, I guess, which I think we've all seen before and heard before. But I just thought it was a very interesting and thorough debunking that he offered up. Let me see if I can find it so that I can pass it on. And I just thought, and there was one standout moment in it at the end, which I was thinking I might highlight. But he takes on this film and book, noting for the record and with an extensive offer of proof that 2000 Mules in no way proves or even shows, doesn't show anything that you could even reasonably take to be evidence of the claims. No way proves or even shows any real voter or election fraud. He offers up what he says is a long thread about that. It's a couple of days old now. But in case you've run into any of the arguments, it might be worth going through it. He addresses the evidence, the so-called evidence offered up by the book and movie about geopositioning. And here, D'Souza relies very heavily, and actually throughout the book, he relies very heavily on the very much discredited group that calls itself True the Vote. We've called their name before, and I know we've heard their name in 2016, but I think these are guys that we've heard of since prior to 2016. They've just been running around insisting that, usually that people, undocumented immigrants, as we would call them, or illegal aliens, as they like to call them, are voting in massive numbers around the country and changing the outcome of the vote. It isn't happening, of course, although, I guess you could have a philosophical discussion, as we have had from time to time here on the show. Why is it that people who have moved here with all intent of making the move permanent and becoming part of the permanent American population, why wouldn't you allow them to have some say in how they're governed while they live here? And I know that the citizenship requirement makes a certain amount of sense in terms of blocking people from, say, flocking in from Russia, showing up in November, registering to vote, like same-day registration, voting as Russians looking to interfere in America's internal affairs and with no interest in remaining here and living under the laws that result from it and then returning to Russia. You wouldn't want that. But in terms of people's uprooting themselves from wherever they come from, even if it's Russia, and moving all the way to the United States and saying, this will now be my home, I will make a living and make my way in this country, there's nothing, to me in particular that says, well, you shouldn't be allowed to have a say in how the country is run because we're afraid of people who are going to vote and run away. If you're not that person, then fine. We'll go ahead and vote. Of course, there's no way of verifying that they intend to stay. So the nearest proxy as well, if you put in your time waiting for your citizenship or make the application and wait the time that it takes, the requisite amount of time to apply for and receive your citizenship, that's a pretty good check that you have long-term interest in staying here and putting down roots and having an interest in how the country functions. So, all right. But inherently speaking, there's nothing wrong with people who've been here for a couple of years and intend to stay here, whether they entered the country legally or not. I mean, we have our disagreements about what that might mean as well. Why would it be so terrible for them to participate in society? I mean, the major complaint every time we hear about it, it's an invasion when they're coming here and they won't assimilate. Well, they're trying very hard to assimilate. They would love to participate in our civic life. You won't let them. You force them to hide in the shadows instead of come out and say, yes, I was born somewhere else and now I'm here and I want to be a part of this society. They won't assimilate. They're hiding from your police. Anyway, that wasn't what we were talking about. We were talking about True the Vote and their dubious record. Anyway, I guess their newest tool is geopositioning. And I guess they offer up a parallel to the January 6th prosecutions in which people are convicted of having entered the Capitol based on the strength of evidence from their cell phone companies showing that their cell phones have been pinging cell phone towers from inside the Capitol building. Likewise, they use geopositioning, these True the Vote people, to show the proximity of the people they accuse of being mules. And remember what that means. The accusation is that they are dropping off multiple ballots from multiple different people at multiple different locations. The accusation being that they're manufacturing those votes and those ballots in order to stuff the ballot box in favor of their preferred candidate. But none of that is actually proven. Anyway, they are attempting to show that these people that they think are mules are present for some reason over the course of the early voting period, which in some cases is extraordinarily long, especially during the 2020 height of the beginning of the pandemic. The period was extended, and they are present at multiple Dropbox locations many times. Except, as they point out here in the picture, you see, for instance, a map of the Capitol building, the outline of the footprint of the Capitol building, where this data is being used in court to prove that somebody entered the Capitol, and it shows them as a dot and all the various locations inside the building and nearby the building from which their location was recorded by cell phone towers. And this person has, I'd say there's probably about 24 hits here, and about 75-80% of them place them squarely inside the building, and a few of them are outside on the perimeter of the building. And so they're shown as dots, and there's lines connecting the dots. I guess this is supposed to be the path that this person took, walking around, milling about inside the building. And then around each of the dots is a lighter circle in similar, like a lighter blue. It's very hard, dark blue dots, and then around them these light blue circles and a little shading inside the circle. And that essentially is explained as the 100-foot radius within which your geolocation data is valid. In other words, it doesn't pinpoint you down to the exact inch on which square inch on which you stood, but rather places you within 100-foot radius of that spot. So they have some pretty good idea of where you are. If your geolocation data says you are inside the Capitol, you're not in Seattle. You're not in Hawaii. You're in Washington, D.C., and you're pretty close to exactly where it says you are, but you're within 100 feet. Could you be at the window inside the building or at the window outside the building? Yes. And as Bump points out here, nobody is going to be convicted on data showing 1 point allegedly inside the building and 10 points that appear to be outside the building, even if part of your circle overlaps the inside of the building. And if you are inside, but part of your circle envelops the outside, you could be outside, you could be inside. It would be indeterminate, and you wouldn't be convicted on it. But if you have 25 hits inside the building and 2 outside the building, and some of these circles and radii put you squarely inside the building with no possibility of being outside, then it's likely that would be taken as evidence that you were inside. Whereas with a Dropbox, it actually matters pretty much the square foot that you're really standing on. Like if you are 100 feet away from a drop box, there's no possibility, and you remain there, there's no possibility that you would have put any ballots in it. You need to approach and stand directly adjacent to the drop box in order for it to work. Other things, like they point out that the locations that they put on a map that shows where there are drop boxes are where Google Maps would put that address. In other words, if there's a building at 123 Main Street that has got a drop box in it or around it, Google Maps will say that the drop box is at the front entrance of that building on the street front. Whereas if in fact the drop box is in the back parking lot, that won't show up on Google Maps. You won't know that. And it could be, 200, 300, I don't know, some number of feet away from where you are. And the fact that you passed by the front of this building from the other side of the street, walking down the sidewalk, and within 100 feet of the front entrance of the building where the drop box is, even if it's hundreds of feet away from that front entrance, that shows up in True the Vote quote unquote evidence as you visiting a drop box. And then of course they show a map of, over the course of say 28 days that the drop boxes are out, and they show geolocation data for the city you live in. If you live in the middle of a cluster of these drop boxes, it looks like you're wandering around visiting every single one of them multiple times, when in fact all it is you passing by the addresses where several drop boxes are housed, whether you visit the drop box or not. You get the idea? So it's very interesting. More interesting still is the debunking of specific sections of the video from the movie, in which they basically show that he has one clip of them asserting that a certain identified so-called mule is making a suspicious visit to this drop box. And he recommends watch the clip with the sound off and then turn the sound on. And if you watch the clip with the sound off, you see a guy arrive on a bicycle, reach into his bag, take out his envelope with the ballot in it, put his envelope and ballot into the drop box, then get set to leave, but then come back and take a picture of the drop box, then get on the bike and go. Well, they don't show him getting on the bike and going. The clip ends there. And I mean, okay, that's a person casting a vote at least, right? But then you listen to it with the audio on and you see where the supposition comes in, and the True the Vote people are there busy telling D'Souza, well, here comes one of those people with all the illegal ballots. And as you can see, he's got multiple illegal ballots in his hands, and you cannot see that. And here he is, reaching, fumbling around in his bag, searching for more ballots. He's just looking for his ballot. Or then he takes the ballot out and he's looking in his bag at something else, for something else. Is his phone ringing? Is he afraid he lost his phone, but he's making sure it's in there? Are his keys in there? Did something spill in there? You have no idea. But they just sit there saying, it's him fumbling around for extra ballots. Then he goes and puts the ballot in the box. They claim he's got 100 million of those ballots in his hand. They claim he's got some multiple of, well, not a multiple of, I guess some multiple of one, but anyway, and one is a multiple of one. And then he gets set to leave, but then he goes back and he takes a picture of the drop box, which to me, without the sound, is like, okay, this is one of those guys who's now going to post a picture to Twitter, although he might not be using Twitter anymore thanks to Elon Musk, but he's going to post a picture to Twitter or Instagram saying, I voted, smiley face, and this is a picture of the drop box, and you're supposed to infer from that this is the drop box I used to cast my ballot, and you should do the same. And look how easy it was, or whatever his message is going to be. But instead, their narration is, oh, so we found out, they didn't find out, we found out that you will only get paid as a mule, presumably George Soros is paying you. You only get paid if you produce photographic evidence that you deposited. So you take a picture of the drop box. Now, of course, a picture of a drop box is not photographic evidence that you put any ballots in it. 1, 0, 500, nothing. It's a picture of a drop box, and that's all it is. I mean, it may have geolocated data that goes along with it. That's true. But It poses several problems, one of which Bump identifies. If you were coordinating a massive scheme to steal an election, would you demand that everybody participating in it take photographic evidence of the massive crime? Probably not. And of course, there's nothing obvious about the picture or the way they take it that isn't just a guy saying, I'm going to take a picture of the drop box I used and brag about voting early and try to encourage other people to do the same thing. It's not but they're curious. It's not a selfie. He didn't take a selfie. It's outrageous. Why in the world? And they ponder, they say aloud, why in the world would anybody take a picture of the drop box that they put their ballot in? And the answer is to show people that they voted early, and that's all. Could there be something nefarious to it? I guess. Is that evidence of it? It doesn't even tend to prove anything. It's certainly not proof. And it's not proof by itself, and it doesn't tend to prove anything. But they're sure that it is. And of course, the other problem is if you suppose that this is part of the scheme and that you have quote unquote discovered, you found out that you only get paid, whether by George Soros or anybody else, if you take a picture of, if you offer some photographic evidence of the ballot having been cast, which this picture wasn't, by the way, then wouldn't you expect, especially if there were thousands and thousands of these mules, that there would be thousands and thousands of pictures in circulation of drop boxes? And in fact, there are, of course, there's lots of pictures that people took. Whoops, excuse me, got the wrong music started. Almost said our show was over. You're forced to do that once the music starts. Well, obviously not the case. But at any rate, there would be thousands of these things. And they have this is security camera footage of the guy on the bike, by the way. And you might ask, does this camera record anyone else taking pictures of them dropping off ballots, whether one or multiple? And the answer apparently is no. They're moving on to the next subject. Weird. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, the same guy who was just talking to you a second ago. Our Patreon subscription drive is still going strong, with over 175 monthly donors who help keep us on the air. If we've helped keep you going during the pandemic, why not return the favor and help us keep going so we can all be together for the next disaster? Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it easy to make secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for keeping you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. So, anyway, as I was saying, you should all have a look at Philip Bump's thread. It's quite convincing. And, you probably didn't even need to be convinced, but you probably also maybe at some point will need to be able to discuss the film, even though it's stupid and been debunked 100 times. And now you'll have some specific reason to do so. But anyway, yeah, you would think that there would therefore be thousands upon thousands of people taking pictures of the ballot boxes. And although lots of people, as Bump himself says, he tweets in this, basically he concludes, look, everything nefarious in the film clip, once you turn the sound up, is just Greg Phillips, the guy with the beard in this picture, and the person who's been involved in True the Vote for however many years. Everything nefarious that this clip purports to show is just Greg Phillips making claims. Does it look obviously like there's more than one ballot? Not really. No, it doesn't. Is he obviously trying to hide what he's doing? No, not really. It's all insinuation. And this guy is not shown going anywhere else. That's one of the other things. They don't show these people showing up at multiple ballot boxes. They show geolocation that shows that they passed nearby the front doors of addresses where there was supposedly a drop box. Although if you zoom out on the map too and show all the locations of drop boxes inside that city, that was another piece of evidence that Bump appears to produce in all of this. There's dozens of drop boxes they don't visit. It's just these 5 that happen to surround the apartment building that the person lives in or whatever, or where they work or whatever the issue was. And, shows nothing. But at any rate, D'Souza et al., he says, insist no one would take a photo of depositing a ballot, but here's just such a photo taken at that exact drop box, because the picture itself was geotagged, right? Because people like to post about voting on social media. And here is a person you see the hand holding the ballot, and it's positioned just above the drop box so that it's visible beneath the edge of the envelope of the ballot. Here in Fulton County, Georgia, is the one that they're talking about. And of course, by the way, in some cases, there's video where it does appear that the person has more than one ballot. And what's interesting is that, again, the voiceover in the film insists these are illegal votes. As it turns out, the person in the video in that instance has been identified, was visited by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, that's what they call their investigative arm down there, and cleared because he was depositing, in fact, his own ballot and the ballot of an immediate family member, and that is apparently legal under Georgia law. And so they said, all right, we checked it out and looked at the video. When we went and identified the person, visited them, asked questions, they said, yeah, it was another family member's ballot, and they have no proof of anything otherwise. So as far as the Georgia Bureau of Investigation is concerned, that person is cleared of the charge. And yet there it is on film. And guess what? That person is suing D'Souza and the film company and the film distributors and the book and everybody else involved with it for making this scurrilous accusation that has been investigated and dropped by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. So that's an issue. But yes, people actually do take pictures. What you would expect to find, though, since this bike guy is dropping off, at least at this bike guy's preferred drop box location, there's a security camera. And I think the issue, or the fact is that there were security cameras on lots of, if not all of the drop boxes. You would expect them to be able to readily produce pictures of someone who's obviously the same and dressed in the same clothes and everything, arriving in the same car, etc., stopping at multiple boxes and making deposits at multiple boxes. But they never offer that, nor do they show. You would expect to see that at least, some large number of other people and really certainly anybody they suspect of having multiple ballots would be taking pictures of the drop box. If we're right and lots of people take those pictures, you would have lots of security camera footage of people taking those pictures. But if they're right and people's getting paid as mules, thousands of people getting paid as mules is dependent on getting those pictures, you would absolutely expect to see hundreds, if not thousands of people taking pictures of this drop box, and they have every opportunity to show those multiple pictures. It's just that they don't have them, because the truth is, while lots of people will take an occasional selfie or photo of their drop box and their ballot, the truth is that the vast majority of people are not doing it. They don't care. And they have no particular reason to care, as opposed to their story in which they're all being paid on the basis of these photos. Startlingly few people being paid, apparently, as it turns out, which debunks their whole theory. But let's make a movie. Anyway, it didn't have to be that long, but I thought Philip Bump has done a tremendous job, I think, in documenting all that. There's a lot of journalists doing really good work on these things and putting out very definitive debunkings. It's easy to do with Dinesh D'Souza, certainly. So, at any rate, I just wanted to share that one with you. There's lots of other things to get to. Speaking of, I guess we'll stay in the same vein. We've heard a number of these stories too, but this one is particularly well done and documented and well written and explains a whole lot. This is the now commonplace story, this one reported by ProPublica, of local elections authorities, local elections officials who are either hounded out of their jobs by election denialists, or in some cases who hang on in their jobs, but are nonetheless hounded in the course of doing their jobs by local denialists, and what that's like and how many of them, we've also heard stories of how many of them have just given up. This is one about a woman who's on the brink of doing so, just to show you kind of what she's dealing with, even in small town America where everyone knows each other. And that's part of the theme of the story. Everyone knows one another, so she believed it would never happen to her because she's had decades-long relationships with these people, but they've suddenly turned on her because he's bringing Americans together. This, like I said, in ProPublica, a county elections director stood up to locals who believe the voting system is rigged. They pushed back harder. Yeah, so even if you actually say, I'm going to show everybody, I'll let them observe, I'll bring them in here, I'll explain everything, it doesn't matter. They don't care. They don't want to believe you. The subheader here reads, even in a county where Trump won more than 70% of the 2020 vote, local election deniers have mounted a campaign to access voting machines and slash the election director's pay. Why? Because reasons. They're suspicious of something, even though, as they point out, he was credited with 70% of the vote, more than 70% of the vote. But I guess they believe that he got 80% of the vote. And so therefore there's this nefarious, why would this person who's known them for years put her life and her whole credibility on the line to cut down Donald Trump's margin in the county from 80 to 70? It just doesn't make very much sense just on its face. Dig any deeper and it's just dumber. So let's dig deeper. Why don't we? Doug Bach-Clark is the author on the piece, just published yesterday, and it begins this way. On a Saturday in late March, the woman who runs elections in the rural hills of Surry County, North Carolina, was pulling another weekend shift preparing for the upcoming primary when she began to hear the other side, on the other side of her wall, the thunder of impassioned speeches. This is in March of this year. She was dismayed that the voices were questioning the election she'd overseen in 2020 and implying that corrupted voting machines had helped steal it. She also believed it was no coincidence that the Surry County GOP convention, the highlight of which was a lecture from a nationally prominent proponent of the stolen election myth, was taking place in a public meeting room right next to her office. The elections director, 47-year-old, and I think it's Michella, or it might be Michela. I don't know how she pronounces it, but it's spelled like Michella. I think Michela Huff, who lived in the county since high school and knew many voters by name, considered it ludicrous that anyone could think the election had been rigged in Surry County. Donald Trump had received upwards of 70% of the roughly 36,000 votes cast. Huff, a registered Republican for most of her adult life, and you'll find out about why that changes, had personally certified the vote. And you'll find out once again, no good deed, no considerate deed goes unpunished, right? Yet people had begun approaching Huff in church recently because she's there, because she's so Christian, and she obviously feels a strong interest in attending church, but for everybody else that excuses them, right? I'm not a bad person, I'm a churchgoer. She's a churchgoer, yeah, but she's a bad churchgoer because I disagree with her now. Anyway, so there she is in church. People have begun approaching her there, saying things like, I know you didn't do anything, but that election was stolen. In February, a longtime acquaintance of Huff's cornered her in a bluegrass music store and berated her with complaints rooted in conspiracy theories. I don't know if they sang them or not. Huff started limiting her trips to town, which was a good idea anyway because of COVID, even doing her grocery order online. I didn't want to have to deal with that, she said of the election backlash, but it was hard to live in partial hiding. I'm not that kind of person. I'm a people person. Unbeknownst to Huff, a national network of election deniers had been making inroads in Surry County on the fringe of Appalachia. In early 2022, several members of the Surry County GOP had attended a training put on by North Carolina Audit Force, which describes itself as a group that forms grassroots coalitions to, quote, reveal election irregularities, unquote. They were taught to, quote, canvass for election fraud by door knocking to check for inaccuracies in public records, such as if a different person lived at an address than was listed on the voter rolls. Discrepancies, canvassers claim, can indicate fraud, though experts say that canvassers often misinterpret normal imperfections in difficult-to-maintain voter lists, such as someone failing to update their address when moving. It could be as simple as that. If it says here, Jones, Mr. Jones lives here, and you're Mr. Smith. Yes, Mr. Jones moved. He sold us the house. But you say Mr. Smith, this voter roll says Mr. Smith is registered to vote here, and you're not him. No, but we're Mr. Jones. I'm Mr. Jones, and if you notice, your list also says I live here. Yes, but it says the two of you live here, so it's a discrepancy, and so therefore something voter fraud. No, the guy just didn't change his own registration. I created my own and did it correctly, but I can't deregister him. But that's all it takes for them. By early March, canvassers were crisscrossing Surrey County following walk books, as they called them, put together by data analysts associated with North Carolina Audit Force, who mapped routes for efficiency. If you're going to do it, you might as well map your routes for efficiency. The featured lecturer at the Surrey County GOP convention, Douglas Frank, is the face of the nationwide canvassing movement and claims to have established campaigns with the help of, quote, supermoms in at least 40 states. There's no super dads in this network for some reason. Frank and other speakers spent hours at the convention blaming corrupted voting machines and collusion among Democrats, big tech, and nefarious forces for stealing the election. But as you recall, the election supervisor here is a registered Republican for years. The Assembly ultimately passed resolutions to create an election integrity task force and push for an audit, tactics espoused by Trump supporters. The following Monday morning, Frank showed up at the service window of Huff's office with William Keith Center, the new chair of the Surrey County GOP, and a woman who signed the guest book as NC Audit Force. What's your name? Your name is NC Audit Force. I see. Huff believed that the group wanted to get inside her office where voting equipment was kept, so she stepped into the cramped lobby with them, letting the door to her office automatically lock behind her. The bow-tie-wearing Frank began complaining to Huff about, quote, phantom votes, discovered through canvassing, and declaring that if he could just take an electromagnetic field meter tool to her DS-200 ballot tabulators, he could reveal a minuscule modem that had helped switch votes from Trump to Joe Biden. It wasn't the first time that Frank had encouraged an election official to let outsiders access election equipment. Hadn't happened, but he's been encouraging it or asking for it apparently a couple of times. About 11 months before, he'd offered to bring in a, quote, team to, quote, audit machines for Colorado officials, according to an affidavit for an arrest warrant of an official charged in the incident and to Frank himself. And we know who that was. What's her, all I remember is her name was Tina something, right? Wasn't it? Or was that, the county clerk from Mesa County, Colorado that we were talking about. I can't remember what her name is offhand, but that's the story we're talking about. Tina Peters, that's it. And apparently this guy, Mr. Frank here, is the one who showed up and talked his way into the storage area for their voting machines, and now he wants to do this in North Carolina as well. In September, Frank posted on Telegram that his phone had been seized by FBI agents investigating the incident in Colorado. According to the Washington Post, Frank has not been charged. Now, a quote from him, "My objective is to help the clerk understand how they're being hacked and what they need to do to fix it," Frank said when asked about Colorado, using another term for election officials. That is to say, some people call them clerks, others call them something else, etc., etc. In reference to Huff, He said, I was there trying to offer a service to the clerk. I always assume clerks want to have clean elections, which is why I offered to help her find out if her machines were online or not. Frank claimed to have convinced, quote, dozens of other election and county level officials of the need to probe voting machines. And that's why counties all across the country are taking the machines out of the election process. That's what he's saying. It was not Frank who most concerned Huff, however, but Center, a high school auto shop teacher and cattle farmer with a mechanic's calloused hands and a baseball hat declaring, "Pray for America," atop his silvering hair. The new GOP chair, that's Center, who, according to 3 members of the Surrey County GOP, replaced a predecessor who hadn't sufficiently backed claims of election fraud, would remain in Huff's orbit long after the barnstorming Frank left town. Indeed, Center was only at the beginning of a campaign that would include efforts to drastically cut Huff's pay and call into question even the most mundane functions of her office. Huff told ProPublica that as the men pressured her for more than an hour, Center threatened that she should comply with their demands or the county commission would fire her. She initially described this incident in an article by Reuters, linked herein. She feared that her reddening face and neck gave away her fear. The commission, by the way, has no authority to fire Huff. She is appointed by and answers to the county and state boards of elections. Center denied threatening Huff's job and wrote to ProPublica that, quote, I speak loudly because I do not hear well. I drove a loud race car for years and have shot high-powered rifles all my life, so look out for me, rawr. So I have high-frequency hearing loss. Apparently that's why he's screaming at Huff, not because he was angry, but because he can't hear because he's such a manly man. Anyway, Frank said that descriptions of Center as threatening were overblown and that he might have been emphatic, but never, threatening. But Huff refused to give in. Huff is hardly the only election official struggling to stand up to those who believe the voting system is rigged. Such confrontations have dramatically unfolded across the country, from Hood County, Texas, to Floyd County, Georgia, to Nye County, Nevada. Remember them? Nevada. Each one of these things linked, of course. Her circumstances illustrate how the efforts to target her are part of a larger playbook with tactics that are replicated throughout the country. Election officials in small rural offices are absolutely more vulnerable, said Paul Manson, who studies the demography of election officials and serves as the research director for the Elections and Voting Information Center at Reed College. Because such offices have fewer resources, Manson said, they have a harder time adapting to the increasingly controversial nature of election administration in the United States. These types of offices also represent the vast majority of the nation's roughly 10,000 election jurisdictions, according to Manson's research, with 48% of offices staffed by only 1 or 2 people, and an additional 40% having between 2 and 5. Hull's office has 4 full-time staff members, including her. As she juggled budget challenges and harassment, Huff has sought help from the North Carolina State Board of Elections, but that agency has faced struggles of its own. The GOP-dominant legislature has deprived the board of federal funding it had intended to use to hire and retain staff, instead sending it directly to counties. Moreover, groups claiming election fraud have organized campaigns against the agency, leaving it straining to support the 100 far-flung county boards of election it oversees, officials say. Laws and regulations were not written for the hostile environment of today, said Richard L. Hasen, a professor and director of the Safeguarding Democracy Project at the University of California. I think Professor Hasen has come up before. Many of the individuals challenging election officials are even using the law itself, such as overwhelming those offices with public records requests, a practice that Center would soon take up in Surrey County and that election integrity groups as they call themselves, would employ against the North Carolina State Board of Elections. By the way, professor at UCLA, I didn't finish which campus of the University of California Hasan is at. Now, Hasan warns the country's election infrastructure isn't designed to stand up to one of its two major parties turning against it. That's a pretty key turn of phrase, if you ask me. Now, when Michaela Huff accepted the job as Surry County's elections director in 2019, she thought she knew what she was getting into. On her first day, in October, she parked at a strip mall neighbored by cornfields, a hunting supply store, and a chicken processing plant, and walked into a former grocery store, which had closed as the region bled jobs and had been renovated to house the county's tax, agricultural, and elections divisions. After more than 2 decades as the head of groundskeeping for Mount Airy, the locality in North Carolina, the population of roughly 10,500 and the largest town in the county, located about 100 miles north of Charlotte, she was now giving her aching back a rest and working in an air-conditioned office. So just switched county jobs from groundskeeping, head of groundskeeping for Mount Airy to county elections commissioner. Each fall, for most of her adult life, she'd taken a few weeks off from mowing and planting to be a poll worker during early voting, and then run a polling site as a chief precinct judge on election day. Though the days could be long and the pay little, she loved how some people kept their I voted stickers pristine to add to lifetime collections, and how others brought in homemade grape jelly for poll workers. Most of all, she was motivated by the certainty that she was making American democracy function. After the 2020 presidential election went off smoothly, Huff was aware of the Stop the Steal movement promoted by Trump, but given her knowledge of how election security worked, she knew that its claims of Venezuelan software flipping votes from Trump to Biden were baseless. In the aftermath of January 6th, she assured herself that that kind of chaos would never come to sleepy Surry County. But instead of the conspiracy theories dying down, they intensified. Soon after taking the job, she had switched her party status to independent. Remember, she was a Republican, registered Republican most of her life, but not all of her life, not currently. Why not? Because she has just switched it shortly after taking the job to independent. Why, though? Soon after taking the job, she had switched her party status to independent. I just wanted to make this more like 2000 Mules, you see. So she switches her party status to independent. Why? Quote, to reflect the way that this office must be portrayed in a nonpartisan manner. She actually says, well, how would it look for election fairness if I run this office as a registered Republican? I will switch to independent. On the one hand, you might look at that and say, well, that's just, that's a pretty thin veneer. You are still a Republican. You're obviously Republican leaning. You just don't want anybody to know that so that they could use it against you and accuse you of pro-Republican bias. But here, of course, it doesn't matter, because if you change it, 1, they'll still accuse you of bias, and 2, if they need to accuse you of pro-democratic bias in order to make their point, they will do that, even though you've never been. The one thing you've never been in all of this is a Democrat. But in other words, though, she's doing something that she thought, well, that's what everybody would expect of me, because they expect me to run a clean and non-biased, non-partisan elections office, so I'm going to do that. And instead it becomes, aha! Change your registration, eh? Dun, dun, dun. All right. Well, anyway, it wasn't until Biden took office that people in the community began to ask her about this switch. In other words, they said, oh, so you've changed and you've turned against Republicans, and now all of a sudden you're helping the Democrats with their claims that Republican claims about voter fraud are untrue. What made you decide that at the same time, more or less, that you turned your back on the Republican Party, you were also going to undermine their claims to actually having won the election? And that's how this came together. So it wasn't until Biden took office that people in the community began to ask her about this switch. Huff recalls that one afternoon in early March 2021, she was surprised by a visitor at her office, Kevin Chenault, Schinault, her former elementary school teacher. How about that? And a GOP precinct chair who she said accused her of participating in a debunked conspiracy theory known as Zuckerbucks, one of the dumber names that they have floating around there. In 2020, of course, Meta, that is to say Facebook, CEO Mark Zuckerberg had provided grants to election officials through the Center for Tech and Civic Life. That's the mechanism that he used to distribute these grants to help with unexpected pandemic expenses involved in voting, and critics held that this had been part of a plot to throw the election to Joe Biden. Huff happily explained that the $48,584 she'd received from the group had been used for straightforward expenses, like hiring a Spanish language interpreter. Oh my God, Spanish language! That can, of course, mean only one thing: importing millions of illegals to vote from Central and South America. Sure. Nearly every election office in North Carolina has accepted such grants. Chenault, however, argued that hiring a Spanish language interpreter had nefariously boosted Hispanic participation to the Democrats' advantage. Huff assured him that helping Spanish-speaking voters wasn't partisan. Chenault did not respond to requests for comment for this article, by the way. That night, Huff attended the bi-weekly county commissioners meeting at which the chair of the county elections board asked the 5 county commissioners to split $20,000 left over from the previous year's federal grant and split it between Huff and her staff as belated hazard pay for their efforts during the pandemic. Huff figured it was a routine request. Numerous other counties had used the money this way. Surrey's bipartisan elections board had already signed off on it, and records show that about 2 months earlier, commissioners had reviewed the grants without comment. The county commissioners, however, sharply questioned the chair of the elections board for nearly an hour, implying that unless more county employees got such pay, it wasn't fair. All of a sudden, it became part of the big Zuckerbucks conspiracy. Woo, look out. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. You know what? I forgot. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I was watching the Twitter feed and remembering there was one other thing I meant to mention about that Philip Bump thread about the 2,000 Mules thing. I know I already spent so much time on it, but I was struck by this, and I now see the tweet that resulted from that flying by in my own Twitter feed again. And it was that one of the geolocation maps Bump says as a postscript to his thread. I didn't even mention that one of the maps that they use in the movie and the book, I guess, showing a quote mule visiting a drop box in Atlanta several dozen times, is actually a map of where? Not Atlanta. So that's the hint. It's Moscow. Isn't that weird? Moscow. And why do they keep accidentally using pictures of Russia or Russian troops in people's ads, Republicans running ads to honor the troops, and they show pictures of Russian troops, or whatever, cityscapes, or even, fields for support our farmers, and it's a field in Russia, or whatever. And here too, here's a mule dropping off ballots in multiple locations, and it's actually a map of Moscow. What a mistake to make. That seems weird, don't you think? I wonder why that keeps happening to them. So mysterious. All right. Back now to the story, though, in Surrey County, North Carolina. And I know, so this is a good day since we're not going to get our usual Joan visit to do these long reads. I think we have these vast expanses of time. So you get into these stories, or you get to elaborate on stories that aren't really that long. But where were we? The county commissioners were meeting, and the question on the table was, hey, that discussion we've been having for the past couple months about what to do with the leftover federal grant money. Shouldn't we split it up among the 4 people working at the elections office who worked throughout the pandemic, exposing themselves to the greater danger of infection just to make sure that our election could run smoothly? They all basically said yes. But in the intervening weeks that it takes to move from all of us pretty much think it's a good idea to making it official at the next meeting, there's an intervention. And the conspiracy theorists get a hold of these commissioners and say, if you vote to do this, you're voting to throw your lot in with all of these conspirators who stole the election. And then all of a sudden they panic. So now you have somebody tries the approach of, well, why should the elections workers get extra pay when the rest of the county workers, who were just as essential in many cases and who also exposed themselves in various ways to increased risk of infection, they're not getting that money? Well, that's true, but of course this was a grant for the purposes of operating elections. And the people who showed up to whatever it was, mop the floors in City Hall or whatever it was that was deemed essential at the time, as essential as they are, they really can't be paid out of a federal grant that was intended to pay for election functions. Only elections function people should really be able to be paid that way. But you might decide nobody deserves a benefit unless everybody gets a benefit. And that was the initial approach here. Right, county commissioners suddenly sharply questioning the chair of the elections board for nearly an hour, implying that unless more county employees got such pay, it wasn't fair. Eddie Harris, a commissioner who works at a luxury saddle-making company that his family owns, sounds like he's doing okay, declared, I will never take 1 penny from Mark Zuckerberg or any of his ilk. And why would you? Mark Zuckerberg never bought any saddles from you guys. And apparently you're not in need of anybody's money for anything because you own a saddle company. But anyway, he called the Meta CEO a left-wing, interestingly enough, left-wing radical extremist bigot. Center wrote to ProPublica, along with this claim, I guess, as a party, we approached the commissioners, the people who run the county and the county elections, and asked them, although he says ask, but asked them to send the Zuckerbucks back. And they agreed. Harris did not respond to requests for comment for the article. So there you go. Now the $20,000 leftover grant money goes back because they say it's Zuckerbucks and no hazard pay for people who put themselves on the line to run the election and run it well. Huff realized that her decades-long relationships with people wouldn't prevent them from envisioning her as part of some dark conspiracy. And we hear that all the time about people poisoned by Fox or Breitbart or Tucker Carlson or whatever, people who, whose own brothers and sisters or aunts, uncles, cousins, whatever, accuse them of being participants in some grand conspiracy. And you say, "Why? You know me. Why would I be doing that?" I don't know you. Maybe you've been brainwashed. This all it takes. They just come up with another story to explain the discrepancy. I know this person and used to trust them, but now I think they're part of a conspiracy. And in order to maintain that conspiracy theory, I have to now believe that I never knew this person very well after all. And they're willing to say it. So Huff realizes that her decades-long relationships don't save her in any way. The next month, the commissioners unanimously voted to return nearly $100,000 in pandemic grant money, including the Center for Tech and Civic Life grant and around $60,000 from the USC, a lot of things coming through California, the USC Schwarzenegger Institute for State and Global Policy. Remember the other day when we spent a little bit of time trying to do we were reading about Arnold Schwarzenegger and his tweet thread about this stuff, and the first he wanted you to know I remember when we were trying to do it, and I can't even remember what we were talking about. I just remember trying to do the voice. At any rate, yeah, here it's referenced again. The Schwarzenegger Institute for State and Global Policy. They sent $60,000. And they also, the county voted to return the $20,000 in federal funding rather than divvying it up among the election staff. So again, they had $100,000 altogether. $20,000 from the Center for Tech and Civic Life that they called Zuckerbucks. $60,000 from the Schwarzenegger Institute that they didn't call anything, but I guess could have called them Schwarzenegger bucks or whatever. And another $20,000 somewhere else, right? 60, 70, 80. There's another 20 grand. Oh, right. The federal funding. So that's interesting too, by the way. Federal agencies sent, well, at least they had 20,000 left over. I don't know how much they sent initially and didn't use, but the total of 100,000. Only 20,000 of which was Zuckerbucks, which doesn't mean anything in particular except that it came from the foundation founded by Zuckerberg. But all bucks, in their view, became Zuckerbucks because reasons, and $100,000 that could have been used to fairly administer elections in sleepy little Surrey County, North Carolina, all got returned because reasons. Now they're short on funding, and they're going to have a difficult time with the next election, and difficult time with any number of other things that they'll have to divert money to elections if they want to run them at all from other areas in the county, because there's now a $100,000 shortfall because somebody came up with the term Zuckerbucks. And because there were other kinds of bucks there too, it all becomes Zuckerbucks. And then you imagine voting for a person who said, we got $100,000 in free money from other sources to help deliver services in this county, and we voted to send them back because somebody came up with the phrase Zuckerbucks, and I believed it. Huff felt that returning the money was very unfair, but she resolved not to let it affect her performance. What a giving person. The best way to rebut conspiracy theories was to run her elections perfectly. No, it isn't. There's no rebutting them. She hoped the election conspiracy theories, quote, would be a dead issue after the money was sent back. So not only we're going to run things your way, we're going to be open about things, we're going to respond to your records requests, we're going to explain what happened, we'll send the money back, I'll run a perfect election next time. There's nothing plus nothing plus nothing plus nothing plus nothing you can do to make these people believe you. So all the money gets sent back. She figures now it's a dead issue, right? Their claim was that we were participating in a conspiracy for money. Get rid of the money. Get rid of the conspiracy theory, right? Nope. Once Center and Frank confronted her in March 2022, she realized the target on her back was permanent. After that heated visit, Center kept showing up at the elections office. With the service window between them, Huff helped him file public records requests, which he insisted on scrolling by hand. He explained to ProPublica that the handwritten requests were necessary so that they would not be doctored by anyone else. Huff politely did her duty, but whenever she saw him, my gut flipped. It makes me angry that he has that power. I can't help how my body reacts. When Huff and her staff finished work late in the evening, police escorted them to their cars, past campaign-style signs that Center had put up, reading, "The people's trust is shattered," all caps for shattered, and "we demand a full forensic audit," even though nobody knows what that means. Huff repeatedly took those signs down until the sheriff decided that the signs should stay up as they were legal political expression on public property. In March and April, Center sent numerous emails and texts to the county commissioners, which ProPublica obtained, ironically enough, through public records requests. On March 31st, he emailed the commissioners, the people who are the bosses of or who set the budget and everything else for the elections office there in the county. So Center sends emails to the and texts to the county commissioners, which ProPublica obtained through public records requests. On March 31st, he emailed them asking to, quote, please consider our recommendations that are in the attachment, which included a suggestion to reduce Huff's pay and stated that there is no requirement to fund any additional election support staff. Though Huff answers to the county and state election boards, the county commissioners set her budget and salary. You see how that structure works? She's administered by a state and county board of elections, but the budget comes from the county commissioners, different body. Later that day, Center texted the commissioners, y'all, it says it right there, y'all might better get McKella in check, yar, complaining about her charging 5 cents a copy for public records. Can't have that. It's gonna get ugly if she don't jump on board. Cut her salary to $12 an hour like the law says you can do. Parenthetically, it says Center told ProPublica the ugly part is in reference to the phone calls, texts, threats, and pressure I was receiving due to her lies and deceit that she reported to the media. But his message to the commission made no reference to those things, and Huff said she had not spoken to the media about Center as of the end of March. So a thin excuse. The North Carolina law does specify that elections directors can be paid a minimum of $12 an hour. That would be less than $25,000 annually. But 2 lawyers specializing in elections told ProPublica that any attempt to drastically reduce Huff's salary, which was $71,000 as of March, would almost certainly be struck down, as courts have found that election director salaries must be in line with those of their peers. A ProPublica review of election directors' salaries in North Carolina found that the average is about $61,000. Commissioners responded only occasionally to Center's messages about Huff, according to the documents ProPublica received from public records requests, such as the commission chair texting Center instructions for how to avoid paying for public information requests to Huff's office. The 5 cents a page that he was complaining about, the commissioners told him how to get around it. Maybe not a great idea, but they thought maybe it would shut him up, at least about one complaint, but it just means he'll come up with another one. Only one of the county commissioners responded to a request for comment, Mark Marion, who said, "We have signified that we are behind our elections department." When pressed for specific instances, he pointed to, quote, our day-to-day conversations and visits with elections staff. Doesn't really say much, though, does it? At an April 18th commissioners meeting, Center asked the panel during a public comment period to consider not using the county's voting machines in the upcoming May primary because of his and others' suspicions that they had been corrupted. He was backed by a parade of speakers, among them Chenault. At a commissioners meeting the following month, the room was filled, with the overflow watching on a live stream. Essentially, the whole meeting was given over to election deniers, some of whom traveled from elsewhere in North Carolina and the nation, and presented slideshows on the vulnerabilities of voting machines and the so-called evidence from canvassing efforts. Near the end of the meeting, a commissioner read pre-written remarks explaining that the requests to discard the voting machines were outside their power. Yes, that's right. The county commissioners don't control what machines are used in the elections. That is up to the county and state boards of elections that oversee their local officials there and determine the mechanics of how the elections will be run. The county commissioners set the budget. They could zero out budget for any new machines, but they can't order the abandonment of the old machines. It's outside of their purview. Afterward, the crowd assembled on the courthouse lawn alongside a memorial to, of course, Confederate soldiers. People chanted, "Hell no, the machine's gotta go." A succession of speakers promised to fight on, with one declaiming so vehemently that he tore his lips on the microphone mesh, spotting it with blood. Ew, gross. In late August, Center traveled to Missouri for a weekend-long gathering of hundreds of election deniers put on by Mike Lindell, the MyPillow CEO, who claims to have spent at least $35 million of his fortune on efforts to prove the 2020 election was fraudulent. At Lindell's event, activists from all 50 states touted their campaigns, which often involved pressuring county and state election officials. We had a few victories, Center told the crowd when he presented as the representative for North Carolina. We feel like if you've got a committed group of patriots and some county commissioners that are not afraid to face the establishment and do their job, and local law enforcement that will hear the evidence that you produce to them, we can actually get something done in your county. So, if you like that strategy, hit us up in North Carolina and we'll help you out with it. Meanwhile, he needed help on how to fill out public records requests, and he made the Huff do it too, and she volunteered. What a fool. After returning home, Center submitted to Huff's office a time-consuming public records request similar to one that Lindell had promoted, which required one of Huff's 3 full-time staff members to spend 60 hours at a scanner, uploading 2020 poll tapes, the physical receipts from the tabulators. Across North Carolina and nationwide, short-staffed offices, some of whom have been forced to send back $100,000 worth of grant money along the way. By the way, I'll remind you, short-staffed offices reported being overwhelmed all over North Carolina with often identical requests, the poll tapes. Center's requests to Huff came atop dozens of others from different sources, including a sweeping request from a lawyer for the Republican National Committee. Before 2020, Surry County's elections office had received an estimated half dozen public records requests in each year. In the first 10 months of 2022, it received 81. An ally of Center's filed requests for court-ordered mediation and a lawsuit against Huff, seeking the same records that Lindell's campaign had recommended asking for. While none of the legal actions have so far been successful, shortly before Surry County's 2020 elections-related paper records were to be routinely discarded, the County Board of Elections agreed to preserve them for 3 more years. Huff said that each legal action resulted in her and her staff having to spend significant time with lawyers and on paperwork rather than on actual elections administration. Most laws and regulations that govern public records requests and elections do little to ease the disruptions that Huff and others were enduring and offer few means to hold anyone accountable. I don't think there's a silver bullet solution, unfortunately, said Lawrence Norden, the senior director of the Elections and Government Program at the Brennan Center for Justice, a nonprofit law and public policy institute. He noted that public records laws are necessary tools to ensure government transparency. In a lot of cases, if elections officials had more resources available to them, it would be easier to push back on some of these things. He said that officials in smaller jurisdictions often need to turn to professional associations, nonprofits, or their state elections agencies for help. The organization most responsible for supporting Huff is the North Carolina State Board of Elections, which is responsible for statewide election infrastructure such as its voter registration database and which provides oversight and help for county offices. It had dispatched staff to back up Huff when election deniers were holding rallies in the county and offered legal advice and support over the phone. But the state board, too, was being overwhelmed by public information requests. Before 2020, only several dozen requests would come in per year, said Patrick Gannon, its public information director. In 2021, there were 380, with some coming from the same people, of course, who submitted requests to Huff. Meanwhile, the number of people on the communications team had dwindled from 4 to 2, in large part due to reductions in federal funding and the GOP-led legislature not meeting budgeting requests, according to board officials. By late October, the officials said 5 employees had accepted buyout offers. To make payroll, the agency also let 2 people go and did not fill 17 positions, reducing its staff by more than 20% during its busiest time and limiting the services that it could provide to counties. Huff's experiences with so-called election integrity activists were more intense than what other North Carolina election workers were facing, though many of them were also enduring their own challenges. After the May primary, at least 14 counties reported complaints to the state board about aggressive poll observers According to an internal survey obtained through a public records request, the complaints and additional documentation from one of the counties described 2 instances in which observers tailed election workers in their cars, among other examples of observers intimidating poll workers. This led the agency to pass rules to ensure that observers, the individuals assigned by political parties to monitor elections officials, didn't do things like stand close to voting equipment so close to it that they could see confidential information. However, these rules were nullified when they were sent for approval to a board appointed by the GOP-controlled state legislature. How do you like that? Even states considered to be on the forefront of election administration, such as Colorado, where legislators have passed laws addressing rising security risks, and Kentucky, where the Republican Secretary of State had pushed back against conspiracy theories, have experienced significant disruptions as a result of the organized campaign by 2020 election deniers. It's the new normal. Until we have our political leaders in both parties, that is to say, we need the Republicans to join it because the political leaders in the Democratic Party are doing this, pushing back strongly against it. Norden said one of the individuals helping center in his Surry County campaign is Carol Snow, the North Carolina Audit Force, remember them, leader, who accompanied Center and Frank to the elections office during their March confrontation with Huff. She's the one that signed the book, NC Audit Force. Her name's Carol Snow. Put your name here, NC Audit Force. Okay, whatever. In a May email from Snow to Center with the subject line, Surry County Dirt, which ProPublica obtained through public records requests, she provides him with a PowerPoint presentation. Its 61 slides outline supposed errors in North Carolina's voter registration database. In an August email Snow sent to the county commissioners, copying center, she presented them with supposed evidence of voter registration fraud in Surry County assembled through canvassing. She also suggested that law enforcement could subpoena information inaccessible through public records requests, which she claimed might reveal individual voter fraud or system-wide election fraud. She concluded, "We will get to the bottom of this, or die, or be imprisoned for trying." The commissioners did not respond to the email, but she's vehement. She'll die trying. Trying to what? Trying to get information that might reveal voter registration fraud, or might not, but it definitely would show something, maybe, kind of. Snow declined to comment on the emails. In response to earlier questions about North Carolina Audit Force's efforts in Surry County, Snow wrote, "Americans have every right to oversee our election process. That's what should happen in a free society." And sure, that's right, but on the other hand, you should have to show that there's reasonable cause to believe that the evidence you want ought to be delivered up and can be found if you subpoena it. You can't just say, well, I want to subpoena it, or I want it to be subpoenaed on my behalf. You can say that, but the courts won't issue the subpoena unless you can show that there's reason to believe that it's going to turn something up. You got to make a case. And she just says, well, with respect to making a case, I can tell you this, I'll die trying. Well, get on with it then. Die already. I don't understand what the strength of your conviction is of interest, I guess, only in passing. The question is, do you have any evidence? You'll die trying to find some? Okay. Go ahead. I guess good luck. Maybe you'll find some and you won't have to die. But if you're going to die trying and there isn't any to be found, I guess we'll just sit here and wait for you to die. But in the meantime, you're going to be a pain in the ass. Until recently, Snow was also a leader in the North Carolina Election Integrity Team. This is like the Tea Party thing. They have 50 different names for the same idea, but everyone wants to be a leader of one. So if you can't become the leader of the North Carolina audit force, then you can try to become the leader of the North Carolina election integrity team. And if you can't become the leader of that, you start your own thing called North Carolina Election Patriots and declare yourself the president of that. But anyway, the North Carolina Election Integrity Team, I guess, claims to be a statewide affiliate of the nationwide Election Integrity Network, which has trained thousands of activists in the battleground states to scrutinize elections officials. The network's goal is to make sure there are, quote, local election integrity task forces organized at every local election office in America, according to its training manual, and it lays out how to aggressively scrutinize officials in ways that are similar to what Huff has experienced, such as through filing public records requests and investigating voting machines and voter lists. The goal is for the task force members to be ever present at the election office and board meetings, it reads. Not for any specific purpose, just to be there to be annoying is really pretty much enough for their purposes. But it's supposed to look like they're on to something, I guess. Jim Womack, the head of the North Carolina Election Integrity Team, told ProPublica that the group had nothing to do with the events in Surry County and that Snow's actions there were her business. He and Snow said she had recently left the organization. In other words, what they're telling us here is that Carol Snow is too crazy for the North Carolina Election Integrity Team. She was so crazy she had to switch over to NC Audit Force.
Sup fam, it's your boy Darwin, aka Darwin_Darko, aka the most reasonable man in America, aka KITM's senior black correspondent. You might remember me from such recordings as Spacemen vs. Space Cadets and We Need to Talk About Joe Biden. Today, I want to bring you good news about that thing you've been struggling with. Do you suffer from giving too much of a damn? Do you turn on the series of tubes and find yourself outraged at the particular way some news organization strung some sentences together only to realize, nope, this is not some fictional hellscape? Well, guess what? You no longer have to accept the life of giving too much of a damn. You can do something about it, because even you, yes you, can be a show contributor. Now I know what you're thinking. Hey, Mr. Most Reasonable Man in America, I'm not some professional podcast talking guy. Don't worry about it. Do you have a smartphone or some other electronic recording device? Well, that's all you need. You too can have a segment where you can read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Fair warning though, side effects may include general punditry, having opinions and hot takes, getting stuff off your chest, and hearing your own voice. If your recording lasts longer than 5 to 7 minutes, please consult kagrox@gmail.com. That's KAGROX@gmail.com.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. We continue with this very long story. We're almost done, I think. Might even be able to squeeze in one or two more. I know these are the hard ones to summarize, Scott. But don't knock yourself out. We'll do our best to try and come up with some additional narratives. I think this is just a fascinating look inside at least one case. And of course, all of these things are broadly applicable all over the country. This is one representative example. But I love the level of detail that they get to in all of this. So where do we leave off? Jim Womack, the head of the North Carolina Election Integrity Team, basically saying that this Carol Snow woman had nothing to do with them anymore, and whatever she's doing there in Surry County is her business. She has switched over to the crazy People's Front of Judea, et cetera, North Carolina Audit Force. And I guess if she ever gets too crazy for them, she'll just come up with another organization. Womack estimated that as of August, the North Carolina Election Integrity Team has trained more than 1,000 volunteers who would be present in most major North Carolina counties in November, including Surry. As long as election officials are, quote, doing things in accordance with the law and the books, they shouldn't have anything to worry about, Womack said. And if that causes stress, I'm sorry. Of course, he's not sorry. And of course, as it turns out, at least the claim is that Huff is in fact doing everything within the law and the books. It's just that, but she suddenly strangely has things to worry about anyway, which is constantly having to prove over and over again to, any number of different groups, any number of different people who are willing to call themselves a group, or they could be mules for groups and be registering multiple groups. Carol Snow could have 10 different USA Patriot election integrity teams and be requesting the same 60 hours worth of work on poll tapes for every single one of them. And we may or may not ever find out, but poor Michaela Huff will have to spend her and her staff's time copying those things over and over again and distributing them to every single one of these groups, which are the same person over and over again, possibly. But, anyway, it's a meaningless dodge that Womack says. If you're doing everything right, then you have nothing to worry about. Well, in the end, 2 years down the road, when you lose every single one of these cases that you bring against us, and then we only have to worry about paying the lawyers $150,000 for each one of these cases that we won and spent hundreds of hours winning, then we'll have nothing to worry about. But in the meantime, we'll have to worry about defending and paying for each one of those cases and producing all this information. Anyway, in the months before the November 2022 midterm election, that's coming next week, Huff decided to go on the offensive. We'll see how that works out. The offensive against misinformation. By doing what? Giving speeches to various civic groups about how elections actually work, like the local Real Estate Agents Association. Okay, fine. One afternoon toward the end of the summer, she showed up at a country club for what she had believed was a concerned citizens meeting, and found waiting for her 8 local conservative leaders, including County Commissioner Harris, who had fiercely criticized the Center for Tech and Civic Life money. Remember the Zuckerbucks guy? For 2.5 hours, Huff answered the Republicans' questions, largely about election security, explaining the safeguards that kept voting tabulators from being hacked. The discussion was tense, but civil, right? Isn't that supposed to solve everything? We have a frank exchange of views civilly. While Huff kept her hands clasped atop a table, her feet compulsively kicked an orange golf tee beneath it. As Huff headed for the door, she reminded her hosts, the people who work in the elections office, we're real people who love our community too. Afterward, a ProPublica reporter asked an attendee, Earl Blackburn, a Republican candidate for local school board, if Huff's presentation had made him feel better about election security. Though Huff had taken more than 15 minutes to explain directly to Blackburn how the voting machines couldn't be hacked, he said, I don't know that she has satisfactorily answered my question. To explain how the machines could be hacked anyway, Blackburn referenced a badly reviewed Sean Connery heist movie. Which one are we talking about here, by the way? I guess we can click through to YouTube and see which one it is. I mean, there's lots of bad Sean Connery movies, but okay. Entrapment. Huh. Okay, sure. A 1999 film starring Sean Connery and Catherine Zeta-Jones. So that's a good source, right? Blackburn referenced the badly reviewed Sean Connery heist movie that hinges on thieves dodging a laser beam alarm system to break into a global bank. That pretty much explains what's going on in Surrey County, North Carolina's non-laser equipped voting machines, right? That's what you're dealing with. You spend 15 minutes explaining the chain of custody and the multiple backup systems and how these things can't be hacked. And he says, I saw a movie with Sean Connery that was made in 1999, and he jumped over a laser beam and then ducked under another laser beam. Yeah. So there you go. I don't know you've satisfactorily answered my question. And you have to answer their public records request just the same as if Albert Einstein files it. Although if he files it, that's voter fraud because he's dead. But you get the idea. On September 19th, Huff hosted a watch party in the public meeting room next to the elections office for a live stream of speeches in which experts and North Carolina State Board of Elections members explained election security, hoping that some of the Surrey County GOP might attend, or at the very least, some skeptical citizens, but the only people who came were longtime poll workers who already understood how elections worked. They don't care. You're going to present the other side of the story and have a civil discussion. That's all I'm asking for, a civil discussion of the actual facts. Here's one. No, I'm busy. I got to wash my hair that night. Okay. As September turned to October, she and her staff hosted another event at which they publicly tested the dozens of voting machines that would be used in November to prove their accuracy. Come and watch how we calibrate and test our machines. Come and see it with your own eyes. Come and see that we mark 100 ballots and we mark them specifically 55 for Jones and 45 for Smith, and then run it through and see if we don't get 55-45 as an answer. Change the number of ballots by a known number and run them through again so that it proves that it's not a machine that's simply programmed to tell us 55-45. Come and observe. Of course, the machine could be programmed to give us the other number we know in advance. All right, fine. You give me the number. We'll pull you write a number. You write 10 different numbers that we're supposed to add to the Jones vote. Put them in a hat. Pull out an answer in front of everybody. Open it up. Tell me the number. We'll fill out that number of ballots under your observation. Run it through. See if we get the right answer. I got to wash my hair. Nobody shows up. She hoped some of the election deniers might assuage their fears at the event, but none showed up. No matter how many questions she answered or how many times she proved the soundness of the voting machines, it wasn't clear that she was convincing anyone. When Huff had taken the job in 2019, she had told the Board of Elections that she expected to stay 20 years. But recently, there had been so many nights that she had wondered how she could continue. She said, if this is what every day and every night looks like, how could anyone keep this up for 17 more years? She wasn't just thinking of herself, but also about how the stress she brought home and the controversies surrounding her would affect her children who were in high school and college, and her husband. Coming home late from work each night, Huff parked beside a plot that was normally filled with heirloom tomatoes, cucumbers, herbs, and peppers, but which was now just dirt. Instead of tending her garden, she was trapped all day in the halogen-lit office. Still, in her most hopeful moods, she could imagine that instead of cultivating the land, she was cultivating democracy. This is getting very flighty now. It's a seed. You plant it. It grows. It flowers. It fruits, she said. It takes careful tending to make sure that it survives and becomes something beautiful. Or becomes a flaming pile of garbage, whichever one comes first. I don't know. That's the end of the piece. She's very hopeful, but it doesn't look like there's really good reason to hope, quite honestly. And that's the reason I shared this story with you, to destroy all hope in your heart. Anyway, I don't know. That wasn't the reason, but just to give you this illustrative example in all of this, I found it very interesting and illuminating, if disheartening at any rate. All right, let's see. What have I got here? There's a Mark from Twitter, and I was just wondering, what am I... oh, yes, right. I guess I wanted to raise this possibility, something I mentioned in passing that yesterday in talking to Greg. But I'll just put that warning out here. I really should give it a more comprehensive discussion at some point. But I don't know. I feel like I need another party on hand to do that, or at least maybe not after such a long read. But just letting you know, reminding you that I think we have to get mentally prepared for what's coming post-November. When is our election day again? November 8th? Okay, yes, a week from now. And, you know, we've read all these stories about the county boards of elections being harassed and unable to necessarily do the work the way that they want to do it because of all the harassment and public records requests and the people who just won't take any kind of an answer and, just won't accept any answers, whatever they're given, no matter how thorough, no matter how often their own answers are debunked. But it goes beyond that. Eventually, they're going to have to report results. But I guess we're all anticipating a large number of elections that could be contested, whether they're close or not, But certainly when they're close, you can expect that they'll be contested. And in some places, you can expect that elections that aren't particularly close will be contested as well. And that boards of election will do their best to try to settle these things and give an answer. But that is not necessarily ultimately what will determine the makeup of the 118th Congress, the new incoming Congress. And there's a lot of questions because there's a possibility of creating complications will likely be created. We've seen from January 6, 2021, that the Republican Party is pretty much all in on questioning everything and throwing sand in every gear and wrench in every works that they can in order to try to change the outcome of things, up to and including, challenging the electoral votes in certain states, filing even, and this is the new twist on everything, filing fake elector slates and trying to get them into the hands of the vice president and everything. Every single thing that they could think of to do. They were defeated at every turn, but how often can you turn back every possible breach of the system before one sneaks through? So we're all sort of prepared for that in the presidential context. But listeners to the show and people who will habitually listen to a show like this are probably already aware, but we have to kind of start making other people aware that a similar thing can happen in the midterm elections. I mean, it's funny, all the focus has been on, and rightly so, at least in the context of 2020, we got to fix the Electoral Count Act so that this doesn't happen again in 2024, without paying any attention to the fact that, come January 3rd, and January 6th is when they count the electoral votes, but they are counted by the people who are sworn into the new Congress on January 3rd every 2 years. In other words, you all remember hearing about the January 3rd date because murdery trader Greene was busy meeting inside the White House with the President of the United States even before she was sworn in as a member of the 117th Congress on January 3rd, 2021, 3 days before the riot, of course. But that's the mechanics of putting a Congress in place to open and count the electoral votes on January 6th. Who counts them? The people sworn in as the new members of Congress on January 3rd. January 3rd is when the new Congress members present their credentials to the clerk of the House and the secretary of the Senate, and if all goes normally, are sworn in as new members of that body to which they've been elected. The problem is, what if you have a contest of who's been elected to the House and or the Senate on January 3rd? How do you settle those issues, and who's on hand and who's supposed to settle those issues? Ordinarily, here's what our system is. Ordinarily, nobody contests anything, I think, in the ordinary course of things. But occasionally, and more frequently than you would think, and the reason you think it's perhaps less frequent is most of these challenges not only don't succeed, but they really don't get very much attention in the press. But occasionally there are close contests where there are recounts in progress, or there was a recount, but the aggrieved party doesn't believe the recount was fairly conducted, whatever. And you find election contests. The most recent one that most people who are at all observant of politics might remember, if they're old enough, and now I guess you're getting older, if you remember the Al Franken vote. Al Franken and, I can't even remember who was the incumbent senator at the time. Norm Coleman, was it? And, imagine not being able to remember that name, off the top of your head. But at any rate, it was, let me see if I got the name right. Anyway, but Al Franken's first election to the Senate. Yeah, all right. Norm Coleman was the incumbent senator from Minnesota. Al Franken, the challenger, and close election, lots of contests about it, recounts, et cetera, fights about how the recounts were conducted. January 3rd rolls around. The elections officials in Minnesota say, It's our determination, if I recall correctly, our determination that Al Franken is the winner, but Norm Coleman, then an incumbent senator, although not really after January 3rd, shouldn't have been, but he claimed re-election and so claimed to be the continuing incumbent and challenged the results. And by the way, the Democrats who controlled the chamber at the time, and with overwhelming numbers at that, said, well, okay, it is up to us, and the Constitution actually affords us the prerogative here. We could say we will settle this question here and now. It is our determination that the Minnesota elections officials are correct. They got the count right, and we're going to have a vote to verify it. And we can, we're allowed to vote on purely partisan basis if we want to simply say, all right, we say, look, Norm, it was nice knowing you. Nice try contesting the election, but you just don't have a leg to stand on. Al Franken is the new senator. We hereby declare it. We're going to accept his certificate. We're going to swear him in. And if you want to, you can continue to challenge his right to the seat, but you need to do so as a former senator. And you can take your appeal to the Senate Rules Committee and see if you can convince them to bring the question back to us for reconsideration later on. But instead, they said, here's what we're going to do. We'll just throw the decision of which of these claims to credit to the Senate Rules Committee, and we won't swear in Al Franken. We won't swear Norm Coleman in either, but Minnesota will just be without one of its senators for however long it takes the Senate Rules Committee to investigate, to make a recommendation, to bring that recommendation to the floor, and for the Senate to vote on who should occupy this seat in the Senate on behalf of Minnesota. And it took months. There were court cases going on in Minnesota, fights back and forth, fights among the elections officials, and it went on for months and months, and Minnesota was deprived of one of its senators in the meantime. Even though Democrats could have simply powered it out as a overwhelming, really, majority. So they had 50, 58, 59 seats, all told. Right now, they didn't have, at the time, Ted Kennedy was ill and wasn't perhaps available for votes at the time. But they had 50 plus votes, which was all that they needed in order to install Al Franken, but they didn't. They said, let's let the process play out so that nobody feels cheated. We'll have it all on in the open. There'll be a long process with lots of evidence presented. We'll rely on the courts. We'll let Minnesota play the system out, and then we'll take their recommendation so that nobody accuses us of simply making a power grab for this additional seat, even though it really wouldn't have made any difference. Although I guess if Ted Kennedy had been available more reliably, then you would have had the 60 votes that you need to break a filibuster. That could have made a great deal of difference if, of course, you had everybody on board on stopping a filibuster. But at any rate, that's what happened. And Democrats said, we're going to let this whole thing drag out, even though they could have simply said, you know what, F it. And now everybody pretty much believes that Republicans would, in fact, say, you know what, F it. If we have 50 plus senators already installed and there's a contested Senate seat, just vote for the Republican and put them in there already. Everyone thinks they would do that. Well, it's not necessarily the case. It could be the fact that if Mitch McConnell at that point remained as Republican leader and was assured that, look, once we let the process play out, we'll have an additional vote for Republicans, he might let it play out. But if there was any question that the determination in the courts might go against them at some point, there'd be a strong temptation anyway. If they couldn't convince Mitch McConnell to do it, the strong temptation would be to pressure the Republican senators to replace McConnell as floor leader and install someone who would just hold the damn vote already and install whoever it is who was contesting the seat for Republicans. Similar thing over in the House. And in the House, we don't have, there's more seats. And so I guess they probably contest House seats more often simply because there are 4 times as many, more often than they do in the Senate. But they don't tend to be super high profile cases, but there are a few. And it has happened in the past. And in prominent cases too, things that really stuck in the memory of people who observed such things. Indiana's 8th district for a long time known as the Bloody 8th. It went back and forth, Democratic, Republican incumbents back and forth. And in the big famous Bloody 8th case, it was a former incumbent against a now incoming incumbent who may already have occupied the office at some point in the previous number of years, but two people who are fairly well known in the House contesting the election. And it was a motivating cause for the Newt Gingrich Republicans of the day, because they felt that Democrats had in fact simply made a raw power play in installing their own person. And there were kernels of truth to their claims too, although whether or not, we would all agree with them in the end, highly unlikely, but they had some kernels of truth to cling to. So these contests do happen, but it tends to be one, or possibly in a place like the House, possibly two, a handful. You almost always, if not every single, I can't imagine in modern times that it's ever been more House seats under real, honest contention than you could count on one hand. But suppose there are more. Suppose there's just 10. Suppose, though, that there are 100, because there's that many election deniers running for Congress now. What do you do when there's dozens of such contests going on? What do you do when, and the outcome will be very different depending on whether or not there are, besides the dozens being contested, a majority of Republicans who show up with certificates of election, or whether there's a majority of Democrats who show up with certificates of election. And maybe the difference between who controls the House is in the balance of the dozens of House seats being contested. Who decides? And I guess that the answer has traditionally been the balance of the House, for whom there's been no contest and whose certificates have been accepted by the clerk and the rest of the body, and you've sworn everybody in it. But usually the problem is that usually that's out of the 435 voting members of the House, not including resident commissioner of Puerto Rico and the delegates, etc. But if among the 435, 434 of them don't have any genuine contests and are all sworn in, then there's a body of 434 that will almost certainly more or less represent the partisan breakdown of the House, because it's usually more than just one seat difference. And that body can, it's their prerogative, on a partisan basis if necessary, but they can base their decision on anything they want, evidence or other outcomes from the courts, etc. You make your decisions about who will occupy those seats. And it usually doesn't change the balance of power. Now, in a 50-50 divided Senate, or in a somehow 50-50 divided House, that one seat could make a huge difference. Or, of course, if there are dozens of seats under contention, then that could almost certainly make the difference. And what if a majority of the seats that aren't contested are in fact Republicans, but that an honest adjudication of the dozens of seats that are being contested as between Republicans and Democrats ought, for, in whatever universal truth you choose to accept, have won enough of those seats that the majority really should be narrowly, let's say, in Democratic hands. But all the decisions about whether or not to honor these contests or how to resolve these contests are being decided by Republicans, because a majority of the House that's not contesting its seats is at that time Republican. Is that a fair way to adjudicate the elections? Almost no one would say yes to that, but we've never been, no Democrats certainly would say yes to that. Republicans might actually, might very honestly say that. I mean, they may not believe it, but they say it anyway. They may honestly believe it. I don't know, but they would definitely say it. So we are possibly looking at a nightmare situation where we can't even be sure that a representative sampling of what should be the House of Representatives will be in charge of making the determination of how to fill out the rest of the House. And we don't know how much of that House will be under dispute. We really may be facing a huge constitutional crisis without ever addressing the Electoral College. We don't even make it to 2024 before we have this problem. There's a parallel issue staring us right in the face, the same dynamic that controls with the count of the Electoral College votes, and we think we have 2 more years to solve that, and we don't. We now actually have a clock that starts in a week, and then we have just slightly less than 2 months to figure out possibly how to resolve maybe dozens and dozens of contested races. And by the way, the results on November 8th or November 9th or November 10th or whatever they get around to reporting these things may not even be close to settling it. Or it may obviously settle it under normal circumstances for everybody. All the news consortium says, sorry, this is the results. Everybody, whether they're sorry about it or not, Democrats have won control of the House of Representatives. Or they may say Republicans probably have will control the House because more of them have been declared the winners in their races. But declaring the winners doesn't matter to Republicans anymore either, especially if they're not the ones declared the winners. That's definitely the case. So we don't know when we might find out who controls the House. We may not find out who actually controls the House until January 3rd, 2023. And even then, the answer that we're presented might not be what you or I define as who actually is supposed to control the House. It may very well be the case that more Democrats are actually the winners of more of their election contests, but are simply denied their seats anyway by a smaller number of Republicans simply because nobody challenges their certificates of election the day they show up on January 3rd, because we're being polite and honest. It looks to me like they won that seat, so I'm not going to contest it. But foolish me, because 10 minutes later they're going to say, it looks to everyone else like a Democrat won this seat, but we are going to contest it because they were idiots enough not to contest our election a few minutes before. What a nightmare that could be. No one's thinking about that, and it might be because it's just too brain exploding to think about. But that's our job, exploding your brains, I think, and in which case, what a time for it. Halloween. Happy Halloween, everybody. Hope the zombies don't get a hold of your brain and make a frittata out of it. But that's neither here nor there. I'll tell you what's here now. It's the Justice Putnam Hour, if you will, as he takes over the microphone for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, probably not making any mention of your scrambled brains whatsoever.
From netrootsradio.com.
Something else delicious, though, I'm sure.
You have been listening to Kagro in the morning with David Waldman.
What's on tap? Of course, the Supreme Court arguments about affirmative action. They were brilliantly made, the arguments yesterday. Of course, won't make any difference for the justices, I'm sure. And we should probably talk about that tomorrow and on the balance of the week. We may be able to speak with Joan, by the way, I should have mentioned, sometime later in the week. Stay tuned now for Justice Next.